All right. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. We have an action packed afternoon, so I want to get us started on time. Our next panel is called Impact Investing in the Brain Economy. It is moderated by Cheryl Healy. I'm going to invite everyone on this panel to come on up. Cheryl is a senior fellow at McKinsey and Company and co-director of the Brain Health McKinsey Health Institute, where she focuses on mental, neurological, and addiction-related health. She brings experience across policy, research, and education, including advising the U.S. Administration for Children and Families on behavioral health systems for children and families. Please welcome Cheryl Healy and this panel, Impact Investing in the Brain Economy.
Okay. Am I good now? Okay. So we're so excited for the discussion today. I'm thrilled to be here to facilitate. We have Jeff, Troy, and Samantha who will introduce themselves in a moment. Before we do that, though, just wanted to spend a couple minutes setting the stage for the topic of this panel, which of course is investing for impact in the brain economy. And as David mentioned, I'm Cheryl. I'm the co-director of Brain Health at McKinsey Health Institute. We're an independent entity within McKinsey and Company, and we're focused on bringing research, convening, and resources to make underinvested areas of health more investable. So this topic is, of course, very kind of aligned with our core mission. Make sure. Oop, that's not. My first challenge is to work a slide, and then we'll. Okay, great. So earlier this year, MHI published with the World Economic Forum and a global group of organizations known as the Brain Economy Action Forum, a report that laid out a roadmap globally for how to think about building brain capital. And that roadmap had 5 core levers, which you see up on this slide. The first is about safeguarding brain health. Second, around fostering brain skills. The third, around studying brain capital, so both how to measure it as well as the research that undergirds it. The fourth, around investment, and then the fifth, around mobilization. So, of course, today in this panel, we're really talking about that investment piece. This is not only about how we invest more in brain capital, but it's also about how we invest differently in brain capital. So to add a little bit of color to this, one of the things that we've been doing at McKinsey Health Institute over the last couple of months is really trying to understand what's the magnitude of investment already going into the brain capital space. And this isn't an exercise that's particularly precise just because of the limitations of the data. But at the top line, we see it's around $2.6 trillion, which is to say we're not starting at zero when we're having this conversation today. But we're really thinking about not only how can we grow investment in specific areas, but also how can we think about where there's opportunities to shift what we're investing in to better align with kind of the value to individuals and to society. So a couple of reflections just on the kind of mapping of investment that you see on the slide up in front. The first is on the brain health side, so that's the right-hand side for you all. There's significant investment already happening today. We see it's very concentrated in the treatment space. Where there is very little investment is in prevention of conditions developing and promotion of positive brain health. We also see there's relatively little investment in the research space. So that tells us that there's opportunities to think about how we shift and align incentives differently. On the left-hand side, you can see investment that's going broadly into the development of brain skills. The primary mechanism for this in the US is through our formal education systems, most notably K-12 and higher ed. And so similarly, we see a couple things with kind of this view, where we're investing relatively less is in early childhood education, despite the fact that we know there's a wealth of research documenting that the ROI on investments in early childhood is somewhere between 9 to 11 for every dollar spent. And then also in adult learning. So after folks leave formal education systems, relatively little is being invested in the development, cultivation, and maintenance of their brain skills, both in the workforce as well as later in life. And that investment is characterized largely by it's being carried by the private sector primarily and by employers, right? So it looks a little bit different from the rest of the investment we see in the brain skills space. So, as we think about the conversation today that we're about to have about how we invest for impact in brain capital, how we invest differently, one of the things that we want to encourage the panelists to speak to and for you all to think about is the financing mechanisms really exist already. There are a lot of them that we have at our disposal to deploy and thinking about how we do things differently. And so I think the challenge for all of us in this room is to think about, what are the mechanisms we can use? How do we have to think about investment a little bit differently and incentives a little bit differently to really align our investment to the impact that we hope to see? So with that, I will have our panelists introduce themselves, and I will somehow figure out this microphone in the process.
Testing.
Okay, I failed my first test, but we figured out how to share, so that's great. So we'll start by just having each panelist introduce themselves and talk a little bit about just what brings you to this panel today. What hat are you wearing? And maybe we can just go straight down the line, starting with Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Borenstein, and I serve as the president and CEO of the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. The foundation has been in existence since 1987, and we're the largest private funder of mental health research grants. And we fund scientists around the world with a focus on young investigators and new innovative ideas. And each year we fund over 150 young investigators. They're 2-year grants, so there's 300 of them at any one point in time. And it's very competitive to get the grant, but the decisions are made by our scientific council. And our scientific council consists of experts in all areas of brain research. We have a number of them here with us today, so thank you for serving. They do it on a voluntary basis. We have a number of people who have received grants who are here today as well. And the idea behind it is to give really the seed funding so that the scientists could collect preliminary data and then go on and get further funding afterwards. So that's the model that we've had, and it's had a tremendous impact in terms of bringing people into the field, helping them to develop their career, and then developing new treatments and technologies such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, rapid-acting antidepressants, the development of optogenetics to study the brain, the use of choline supplementation during pregnancy to potentially reduce the risk of the child ultimately developing schizophrenia or other illnesses. So that's sort of an overview, and I'll pass the baton back.
Troy, do you want to go next?
I'm Troy Gnelzy. I've got a couple of hats on today. One, I'm the CFO of Rapport Therapeutics. Rapport Therapeutics.
No.
Well, I didn't like that intro anyway, so I can start over. My name is Troy Gnelzy. I'm wearing a couple of hats, one of which is as an operator of a company that is in the neuroscience space. Specifically, we have a drug candidate for epileptic seizures that just read out a very impressive phase 2. But one of the things that I'll talk a little bit about today is how we got to those phase 2 results, I think is what's going to help lead investment and hopefully new therapeutics for patients on the other side, because it took creativity. And we were just talking about the other hat I'm wearing is as a executive advisor to Sofinova Ventures, which Sofinova focuses on a broad spectrum of investments, but does include several in the CNS space, Rapport being one of them. Prior to Rapport, I was the CFO at Karuna Therapeutics. We brought to market the first new mechanism approved for schizophrenia in over 50 years with a drug that sat on a shelf at Lilly and other places for several decades until the technology advanced to the point where we could determine a path forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and I hope to bridge a little bit of the gap between how investors look at these, but how do we ultimately get opportunities to patients? So thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel.
All right. Oh, great. A microphone that works. One that works maybe too well. So I'm Samantha Schum. I am from the Milken Institute and our SPARK team. So that's our Science Philanthropy Accelerator. And I lead work across both our neuroscience and mental health portfolios there. Essentially, what our goal is and what we try to do is to help people, philanthropists, foundations, and others to deploy capital in ways that have the most leverage and the most potential for impact in different areas of biomedical sciences. So typically what that looks like is for a given engagement, we try to dive right in to that field and really understand who are the players, what are the perspectives, and speak to a lot of people from different backgrounds, specialties, et cetera. And then from that information, identify kind of strategic gaps and ways that we can help to build something that the field is missing to help unlock kind of whatever is a bit stuck. So that could look like a funding or grant program. That can also look like forms of infrastructure like data sharing or bringing together more collaborations and networking. So that's one kind of hat that I wear. And then I actually came up through biomedical research myself, specifically neuroscience and traumatic brain injury. So I also have kind of a lens from the scientist and working at the lab bench, so kind of bringing both the scientist perspective and a perspective of someone who's really looking for efficiencies across the science ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give you guys a challenge. Let's pretend we're on an elevator. We're between floors 3 and 4, and somebody says, explain to me the biggest barrier to investing in brain capital. You have about 45 seconds to explain it. Troy, we'll start with you.
Find a microphone that works. Does this one work? Can you hear me? Okay. 45 seconds. I think the biggest barrier has been our understanding of the brain and our ability to diagnose and track the activity of the drugs that we're introducing, but more importantly, of the patient's disease and the disorder. As I mentioned, Rapport, we used it an FDA-approved therapeutic, but we used its diagnostics capability to identify a biomarker for epileptic seizures. So that allowed us to much more quickly advance our small molecule through the phase 2.
Okay. Samantha, why don't we turn to you next?
So we've heard a fair amount about silos today, and there's kind of a classic silo problem where specialties are not speaking to one another, or researchers, clinicians, and policymakers are not maybe speaking the same language. And that's a place where I think the brain economy framework is really helpful, right? It creates this larger tent and invites many people in. But there's kind of a flip side to the silo problem, and that's the risk that some of these silos arguably exist for a reason, that we need to have kind of concentrations of people to bring enough attention to certain types of issues. And one example of that is serious mental illness. We've already heard a little bit about schizophrenia here and mental illness earlier. People living with these conditions have very unique needs that can sometimes be missed or flattened if we just look at an umbrella of mental health that has sort of a connotation of well-being. So I would say that then the kind of the solution to that is to really look at lived experience from the beginning, bringing people into decision-making and priority setting a lot earlier in the process.
Okay, Jeff, I'll turn to you.
I think that we're really hearing about how to overcome the obstacle today, which is the science, that there really is an opportunity here, given where the science is. We heard Dr. Manji speak earlier today, where the science is. So in the past, people may not have wanted to invest or donate towards brain research, mental health research, because because they didn't think it would make a difference. But we now know the science is at a point that it can make a very big difference. And I would say that's a big change.
Okay, great. So it sounds like we've already started to unearth, some of the different barriers. There's sort of the tracking barrier. There's kind of the understanding of where the science is and the opportunity to kind of truly make change with new investments. There's this issue, Samantha, that you brought up of silos. So as we shift a little bit from barriers to opportunities, Jeff, I'm curious, what do you see as the most compelling opportunity, and what's driving the momentum?
I think really the opportunity, given where the science is now, is a number of areas. There's not just one area. There's a number of areas, whether it be neuromodulation with TMS and other modalities, whether it be the rapid-acting antidepressants, which are useful in other conditions, the research being done on the use of psychedelics, and probably more impactful, the development of new medicines that have the therapeutic effects of the psychedelics without the side effects of the psychedelics. That really is a different mechanism of action. I think that there are a variety of areas that we need to look at, and to me that's what's most exciting. It's not just one thing. There's a lot of areas to pursue, and that's the opportunity.
So I'm going to show my poor listening skills because you just said it's not just one thing. But Troy, if it had to be just one thing, what's something you think investors, specifically investors in the kind of profit-seeking sense, are undervaluing in the market today that you see as an opportunity?
I really think the advancement of our understanding. I think investors, we were talking about this planning, they like novel but not unique. And I think as they get a better understanding of how to transition and how to pattern recognition their way to new drugs and new support and new opportunities, I think they'll begin to put more capital at risk. But I think until then, they're going to continue to have to be shown examples of success, shown how returns can be generated, and it helps. I was fortunate enough to be part of Karuna Therapeutics. Investors across the board made a significant return on a drug that sat on the shelf for 30 years.
Thanks. And Samantha, you're wearing obviously the hat in terms of the role of philanthropy in all of this. I'm curious how you think about this overall ecosystem, kind of the role of private capital and the opportunity to crowd in more investment as we think about some of these spaces that have historically been largely funded by government and philanthropy.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is something that we're thinking about truly every day. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of what makes philanthropy unique. And it kind of starts with the fact that philanthropy doesn't require the same sort of return on investment that is needed in some other spaces. And of course, we all want to see if we invest in something, start an initiative, we want to see that it works. But we're still not beholden to the same type of return that you see in a private capital sense or in federal investing, such as NIH and Discovery Science, et cetera. So that allows, it sounds simple and it's kind of intuitive to what philanthropy is, but it does allow philanthropy to then move in ways that are a bit different. It can be more flexible, more agile, and kind of move in spaces that others can't. So if we think about the kind of R&D pipeline and the classic valley of death where a lot of promising science stalls between discovery science and becoming kind of realized in pharma, philanthropy can play a role very early on in helping to kind of spur innovation before it fits the right profile for an NIH grant. And it can also play a role kind of in that valley of death to help bridge those capital gaps to kind of extend the runway for promising science, because it's, again, not kind of beholden to the same kind of classic grant cycles as maybe the NIH. So kind of given all of that, what we really try to do is operate in spaces where it's not the priority focus of NIH or industry and other kind of forms of capital. And so when I think this system is working really well, we're all kind of triangulating off of one another, and we can move into places where maybe certain infrastructure doesn't exist yet, so it's not quite the right fit, it's not de-risked and appealing yet for certain forms of private capital, and I'm sure Troy can speak more about that. But if we're doing our job well, we can then move in and help to facilitate those conditions to make it easier for private capital to move into that space. And examples of that might be something like a data sharing model that helps kind of unlock an aspect of a field that wasn't before. I'll leave it there.
Could I interject with an example? Because, again, going back to Karuna, because I think it's a great case study for this. The Wellcome Trust, had it not been for the Wellcome Trust, Karuna would have died as an idea that didn't have the opportunity to move into the private capital arena when they made a large investment, which allowed for the production of a modest amount of data. It allowed the company to recruit a seasoned CEO with Steve Paul, who used to run NIMH, and Eli Lilly. And now there are no less than 6 programs that are being funded around the muscarinic programs. And so it was that seed money coming out of, again, an incubator with the seed money that allowed them to move it forward. And now it's created this wave within the muscarinic space, but others evaluating, again, schizophrenia specifically, but it has other implications, elderly dementia, bipolar disorder. And to me, that's a perfect example of how that builds, but it took so many things to line up, and it was philanthropy being a big part of it.
I think you're making such a good point, and I want to broaden that. The early work, the basic science work, looking at the muscarinic receptors, was work supported by BBRF with really that basic research that laid the foundation for then the further development to then make use of this new medicine and the new way of delivering it that potentially can help a lot of people. So it really is a broad, from the early basic science to funding a project to bring it to fruition. It takes a lot, but that's what we need to do. That's part of the purpose of having the summit.
Yeah, no, I love this conversation, and it, in some ways, we're circling around a really basic point, which is this stuff doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design, and it takes more than one type of funding and more than one ecosystem player to make it happen. Jeff, I'm wondering if you have a specific example of de-risking investments and bringing new investors in that you want to share, building on what you just said.
Yeah, I think there could be a number of ways to de-risk investment. The approach that we've had at Brain and Behavior really is like a venture capital fund. So we're funding a bunch of scientists who have great ideas, very innovative with the potential to make a big difference, and we have the expertise of our scientific council to say, hey, these sound like a good idea, let's try it. Not all of them come to fruition, but some of them do, and that makes a difference. So I think really, just as investors do, having a diversity of people that you select, ideas that you select, really is the way to de-risk that investment.
Before we shift gears to talking about sustained impact, I want to throw a little bit of a curveball for the sake of the panelists. I'll say this was not part of our prep at you all, in case anything comes to mind. So, I was talking to somebody the other day about how we think about all the financing mechanisms available to us and what it really takes to diversify and think differently. And I just loved the simplicity of this example around homeownership, right? And the idea that almost no one could afford a home until we just decided to make loans a longer loan, right? And call it a mortgage. And I'm curious, in this space, as we think about kind of what it's going to take to really shift the investment beyond just maybe more coordination and more thoughtfulness in the coordination, is there anything like that that's truly kind of a shift in frame for how we think about financing and how we value things that you all would want to put forward as a thought to the audience today?
I can go first. I think we're already seeing some of that. It takes success because, as I said, investors, they build on one success. In 1 week, there was $1 billion raised around muscarinics, ourself and Cerevel. In just the last 5 years, I've helped raise over $3.5 billion for CNS-related drug advancement. So I think we're actually seeing some of that. I think what we need more of are the interpretable ideas coming early on, because a lot of what we're doing is revisiting drugs that had been out before. The muscarinics were the 70s, I think, and 80s, and then Lilly and others got their hands on it. Rapport Therapeutics, this was identified at UCSF 35 years ago, and we're just now getting to drugging this target. So it's taking time, but I do believe that the investment dollars, we've seen this shift, and I was going to grab this statistic, but I didn't, but it was along your lines. The CNS investment at the institutional level is up 10 times what it was just 5 years ago when we kicked off with Karuna. There were a few smaller companies along the way that started to build some momentum, but now we're seeing returns. That's what it takes, I think, to bring the institutional dollars in, is seeing these returns. At Karuna, we raised just a little over $2 billion, but sold the company for $14 billion. So there was a return on investment. I always say that no person who ever bought and held Karuna lost money, because our largest share price was $240. We sold for $330. Point there being, everybody there had an opportunity to reinvest, and I would say 90% of the investors that I had in Karuna are also in my current company.
Jeff or Samantha, either of you want to add anything on this one?
I'll just add, I think in addition to the private support, people, the venture support, I do think government support is important. And having that support in place, and part of what excites me about what's going on in Houston and Texas is that government support. And I think as we make mental health issues more of a mainstream issue, something that people are more comfortable about, it broadens the support for this. And that then helps get the government support. So I think we need to have both private and government and philanthropic, but you want to broaden that base of support.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how we think about sustained impact in terms of our investments in this space. Troy, maybe I'll go to you first. It's just advice for investors on how to differentiate between investment opportunities that really create long-term value and those that are more just noise in the market and short-term excitement.
So I think what investors have to do is continue to follow some of the innovative science and opportunities that present themselves. I use the example of how many muscarinics are now in development, which is great, but what's the next muscarinic? What is the next one? So I think for an investor to differentiate, they have to follow some of the basic science and take some risks. And I think that's not easy, but it will come as we develop better ways of understanding how the brain works and how the drugs that we're introducing will work. Again, using Rapport as an example, this neurostimulator device had never been used before as a tool for determining the electrographic activity of the drug, but a few investors took a chance on this concept, and it was about a year we spent trying to convince the broader investment community, and there was skepticism, but the results came out, the data were very compelling. Our stock price doubled, so now more investors are interested in it. But now we're aware of 4 other companies that are using or looking at this same approach to diagnose. So I think to differentiate, investors have to be willing to take risks. But as the community developing some of these new opportunities, we have to find ways to help connect the dots for them better.
And Samantha, maybe I'll turn to you next. Where do you think investors should be looking for promising new opportunities?
Yeah, I think this actually kind of ties back to one of my earlier answers, which is about getting out into the field. This is, again, kind of our classic Spark model of talking with a lot of people and people who are really on the ground experiencing a given condition, problem, or circumstance. And that's where I think you'll find a lot of things that are somewhat overlooked and distinct, or places where you can get in quite early. So I'll give just kind of one example of how this can kind of show up in that type of work that touches on a couple of different themes that we've heard today. So earlier we heard a bit about the importance of the built environment and the interplay between our brain health and the built environment. That's not really news to people necessarily in this room, but it is new on the radar kind of in general, that it's a space that not a lot of people are talking about yet, and yet we have a lot of investment in our physical spaces, right? So we really should be able to get those spaces to do more for us. And then where this can come up in kind of unexpected ways is, for example, through some schizophrenia work that our team has been doing. And again, we spoke to researchers, clinicians, individuals with lived experience, caregivers, family members, et cetera. And something unexpected that I kept hearing was about the importance of physical spaces and facilities, green spaces, light, these spaces that convey dignity and respect, because they are places where you would want to be, not a facility where you put people kind of away, right? And so there's a lot of potential there, because I think this is a theme that you wouldn't necessarily hear if you're not talking to people who are really frontline clinicians on the ground, or people who are experiencing this day to day. And yet there's again a lot of potential. I think it's a spot that is maybe a bit overlooked in this field specifically, but kind of more generally. And so that would be kind of my recommendation, is to, you can't kind of shortchange the conversation piece and the value of talking to people and really understanding what they need in order to design solutions that they want and will engage with, and are not just something that we think someone should want.
I love that point, and it's interesting when we were mapping the investments in brain capital and attempting to understand that space. One of the things we looked into was the broader longevity market, where there's so much funding driven by consumers that's not necessarily going to the areas that scientists would argue are the right ones to focus on in spending. And so I think, Samantha, to your point, right, there's something there around merging those two worlds, which we talk about all the time, the science and the individual perception, but really with that lens of investment specifically. And I think that's a really important angle for us to keep in mind. Maybe we'll do two more questions before we close. The first, and maybe Samantha, I'll start with you, is just if you think about kind of what has the opportunity to really reshape markets, reshape society in the next 5 years, and I'm really going to ask you guys, if you had to pick just one thing. It's okay if you don't mention other things that are important, but if you had to pick one thing, what would be the thing that you would flag for folks to really keep an eye on?
It really is hard to pick one thing, and I think that's because we're in such an exciting moment, so that's fantastic. I did not coordinate this with Husseini earlier, but I would say GLP-1s. I think they really are going to reshape things significantly, and there's a real brain story there that has not gathered as much attention just yet as, of course, the kind of metabolic and weight loss story that has had commercial potential, so that's kind of understandable. But we're still pretty early in understanding those biological mechanisms, and we've heard already today about the gut-brain axis, which is wonderful. I think that's a space that's been a bit overlooked, because it's at the interspace between different fields. So that would be kind of another place to keep an eye on.
Troy, you want to go next?
Sure. There's a lot in the political environment and kind of the national news about China. And I think finding ways that we can work together and find a collaboration because of the population that they have, some of the innovative ways they do things, the way that we can. At both Karuna and Rapport, we did partnership agreements with China-based companies. In the case of Rapport, it's with Tenacia, which is a Bain-backed company. So, you've got one of the largest investment groups in the world in the U.S. in Bain, who has a CNS-specific investment in China with a company called Tenacious. So I really think that there's a lot to be gained by working together there.
And Jeff, let's turn to you.
Well, if you're only allowing one thing, which I don't agree with, but I'll go along with it, I think given the severity of depression, given what we see the statistics about suicide, I would say the rapid-acting antidepressants, because it's a game changer in treatment. Instead of having to be in the hospital for a few weeks until the antidepressant effect and anti-suicidal effect gets better, the person with a rapid-acting antidepressant can go to the emergency room, start the treatment. It has an anti-suicidal effect right away. So they could go home safely, continue treatment on an outpatient basis, and go to school the next day, go to work the next day, and not have it get in the way of their life. So if I only had one thing, I'd go for that one.
Wonderful. Thank you. So last question for each of you, and hopefully this is a bit of a gift to our audience. On the topic that we've been talking about today, so this topic of investments within the brain capital space, is there a podcast, a book, an article that each of you would recommend folks check out to learn more and get deeper in this area? And maybe I will start with you, Jeff.
I think people should get information from reliable sources. So certainly NIMH, the major academic institutions are all places to go. I'm going to also do a little advertising for BBRF. On our website, you'll be able to find a link to the Healthy Minds TV show where I interview experts in the field talking about the science and the clinical issues. We have a weekly e-news that talks about cutting-edge research in a user-friendly way for lay people to understand. We have a monthly webinar, again, where a scientist speaks to a lay public about the science. So I think there are a number of sources that people could go to learn about these issues.
Troy, I'll turn to you.
So I would say, and many of you have probably seen anything by Dr. Stephen Stahl, not because the books are, compelling specifically what we're talking about, but because what I think Dr. Stahl has done a good job of over the decades is taking complex brain anatomy and diseases like depression, schizophrenia, others, and he's been able to simplify it and to speak to a more lay and broad audience, because one of the ways to get more investment dollars and more people engaged in the space is people understand it a little bit better. And I think, there's a stigma with certain neuropsychiatric disorders. There's even within experts, there's still a lot that we need to understand about the brain. So taking the kind of folks in this room who are incredibly intelligent, but understanding that and how he was able to communicate, so guys like me who have no science background at all could understand, back to my job at Lilly, I could understand schizophrenia and I could understand its impact on the patient and people. Because I do think that bridging that gap between the knowledge that exists and the layperson is really important.
Thanks for that. Samantha, you want to close us out?
Sure. I think I'm going to give an answer that is maybe in a little bit of an unexpected direction and suggest the book Ikigai. So this is a Japanese concept about what it means to live a good life, and the book essentially gives a framework for living a life that is meaningful, has purpose, connection, engagement, contribution. It's really quite beautiful, and the reason I am recommending it in this context is that, we're having a lot of high-level and very important conversations over these 2 days, and thinking about, the systems and the policies and all of that, but where brain health really matters is in people's daily lives, right? I care about how it shows up in mine and my parents, and I'm sure in all of your lives too. So I would recommend it as a bit of just kind of a grounding in an individual sense, right? About why we all care about this space. And it goes beyond kind of the economic productivity, but it matters in terms of whether people feel like they are really living a happy and meaningful life.
Well, thank you all for a wonderful conversation. I think, one of the things I'm taking away from it is it feels like, it may not have always been the case, but in this current moment, we actually have the pieces we need to rapidly accelerate investment in this space, right? I think as I reflect on your comments across the questions, like a clear message that in many places the science is there, kind of the global kind of infrastructure for how to think about and study these things is there, and the mechanisms for engaging, for better understanding impacts on individuals' lives, for thinking about kind of the role between different parts of the ecosystem is also there. But what I also heard is, there's things that are, now getting investment that have been around for decades, right? And so that also tells us we have a lot of work to do. I think kind of going back to where we started, if we think about kind of how investment is distributed in the brain capital space, it's really clear we have a lot of work to do. So I think anybody in this room, just on an instinctual level, can acknowledge we would rather prevent a condition from developing than get one and be able to treat it. And Samantha, to kind of where you just went, right? There's the positive promotion of brain health, completely moving us away from the more of the condition-based view that we so often are, fairly anchored on. That is a part of the investment space that's not really receiving a lot of as much investment today. So I'm leaving this conversation with hope, but also with a challenge for us to think about. It sounds like we've got the ingredients, but the urgency to kind of accelerate and to have these kind of moments of magic where the investment is really clicking and the stakeholder and ecosystem are lining up rapidly kind of accelerate in terms of how often that is happening, where it is happening, and what across which kind of areas. So I appreciate you all in joining the conversation today.